Bright QT. Every student matters.
Hello students. So let's talk about our next topic here, that is beginning of the revolution in 1789. So which revolution are we talking about? We are talking about the French Revolution, right? So before this, we have talked about the causes of the revolution. Now in this part students, you have learnt about various causes, be it the political causes related to the role of kings or how they were involved in wars and it led to great financial stress, and who is going to suffer here? So the common people, they had to suffer with these wars, right? We also learnt about the intellectual awakening. We also learnt about the intellectual awakening here. Rise of middle class. So we have learnt about the rise of middle class as well, social factors. Then we talked about the economic factors, right? Talking about the subsistence crisis, heavy system of heavy taxation and so on. So I hope that you have cleared your part here till here, that we were talking about the causes of French Revolution. Now we are going to understand how the revolution it began. Now everyone here must know the date, that is 14 July. All the students must know, reading this chapter here, must know that it is 14 July 1789 when the revolution it commenced, right? With the storming of Bastille. So in this part students, we are going to understand the various stages in which the revolution unfolded. But before reading about those parts, let us try to understand, was the meaning or the aim of people related to the revolution same for each and everyone, or were the views different here? So we see that this revolution, it had different aims for different people. So it was not that everyone was fighting for the same aim here. So people belonging to the peasants group, they had some different aim, who were fighting or challenging the French kings or the French government here. So the people belonging to some other class such as the artisans, they were now fighting for their own rights, for their own aims. The working class people, again, they were fighting for their own aims. So let us try to understand what were the different aims of these people here who were involved in this revolution, right? So the peasants, at first, they wanted an end to feudalism and cruel taxes. Now we all know that peasants, they had to face the brunt of these heavy taxes. Yes, students. Now we saw that the nobility, they enjoyed feudal privileges, and you also have learnt about the feudal system, the basic definition that I have given you. That is this relationship between the lord and the vassal. So the lord here, he has a lot of wealth, he has a lot of land, right? And he owns all the property in it, and he gives this land to the vassal, right? He gives this land to the vassal in return of his service, right? In return of the service of this vassal. So this is how this relationship is working here, okay? So this feudal system, now here we see that the peasants who were working under these landlords, they had to pay heavy feudal dues. They had to pay high feudal dues, the cruel taxes. Now these peasants, they did not have a lot of money because they did not have their own land. They had to work on the lands of other landlords. So therefore, they were working on the land, right? And they had to pay these taxes of the produce that they were making on that land. So you can see here that the conditions of these peasants were quite grim here, quite bad, right? So for them, the revolution, it meant freedom from paying these cruel taxes and this whole system of feudalism that should come to an end in France, right? Now the liberals wanted a new constitution which gave them equality and freedom to all. So these liberal groups, right? So they believed in equality, they believed in freedom. So what was this revolution for them? So their main aim was to draft a new constitution, and in this constitution, everyone should be given equality and there should be freedom for all, right? So this was the aim for the liberals. The extremists, right? So people who took actions in their own hands, right? Who believed in violence, that through violent activities they could take the government down, right? So these extremists, they wanted a republic in France and end to the monarchy. All these points we are going to understand here while we will learn how these phases it unfolded when the revolution it broke out in the year 1789. Okay, so one by one we are going to understand all these points here. But before that, let's talk about the initial stage here. The first stage when the revolution broke out in the year 1789. Okay, so right now, we know that who is the king here? Louis XVI. Now, if I ask you when did he ascend the throne, what are you going to answer? 1774. Okay, at the age of 20. Now, he was married to whom? He was married to Marie Antoinette. Right? So, here we see that Louis XVI, when he came to power, see, all these points you have already learned. Here we are just revising these points in order to connect with the point that we are going to read just now. So here we have to see that there was empty treasury, right? And financial stress for the king. Basically, there was this financial crisis, right, during this period. So what happens? We know that Louis XVI was a weak and indecisive king, right? And under the influence of his wife, he was not able to take decisions and he was quite greedy, right? So all the money that was now, he threw all the money for his own, according to his own will. He spent all the money according to his own will. So here we see that he is now facing this crisis, the financial crisis. And riots are taking place all over the place. Famines are taking place all over the place. Are taking place here all over the regions, right? So here what are we seeing? That the king is feeling pressurized. After this period, what we see that in the year finally in 1789 or May 5, 1789, to be much more specific here. So he called for a meeting. Now in this meeting, he wanted to discuss about or solve the issue of financial crisis. Now when we are talking about this meeting, it means that we are talking about the State General's meeting here. Right, students? And you already have learned that there are 3 states here, first, second and third. So you have to learn it by heart here. All these important points are quite simple to understand. So more than 1100 delegates, these members, they attended the session of the States General, right? And there were 600 representatives from these two groups that were elected by the common people here, right? So the session was called to discuss the financial crisis, as we have already told, because Louis XVI was now going to increase the taxes. He was decided to increase the taxes in order to overcome this financial crisis. And he could not take that decision before discussing it with these people, the States General. He wanted to discuss it with them, right? So, here what happened? We know that first, second and third state, right? Common people, they had their own problems. Now, they thought that in this meeting, their issues would be heard by the king here. But was it the scenario there? No, students. So their voices were suppressed, right? Now let us understand about the parliament here, the voting system, how did it work in this parliament. So when we are talking about the first and second states, we see that there are 300 members here, right? 300 members each year in first and second state, and in third state we have 600 members total. The people belonging to the third state, they were not allowed to sit, they had to stand back there, right, in that hall. Okay, now here we see that these two states, the voting that we are going to talk about, it was based on the principle that each state had one vote. Try to understand it very carefully. So when we are talking about the first and second state together, we see that they have two votes combined, right? And the third state, altogether they had only one vote. Now, who is the winning party here? Who is in majority here? Definitely the first and second state. So the third state people, they never wanted this kind of voting, right? The voting system that existed here in the States General. Now the third state, they demanded that voting should be conducted by the assembly as a whole, where each member would have one vote. It means that one person, one vote, and each vote should have this one value here, right? So they did not want this idea that the whole state only should have one vote combined, because they were never on the winning side there, because they were with the majority, two votes. So definitely anytime any issue that was discussed, it always was in the favor of the first and the second state, right? So they challenged this whole voting system here. But we see that the king, he rejected the proposal, and it led to the withdrawal of the third state from the assembly here. This is again one important point here, because you are understanding the basic point, or the first stage of the revolution. Now understand the cycle again here. So the king, he calls for a meeting. Here the voting principle, the voting system is that each state, they had one vote here, and the first and second state combined, they had two votes, and the third state had one vote. So always the winning side was the first and second state having two votes, having the majority. So the third state, they challenged this whole system, and they wanted that each member should have one vote, right? So that they could have equal say here in this parliament. But the king, he rejected the whole idea, the whole proposal of the third state, suppressed their voices, and therefore now, angered by the king's decision, these people, they decided to walk away from the court, right, from the assembly here. But what happened afterwards? This started the whole revolution here. So the third state, they met at the Royal Tennis Court in Versailles and took an oath on June 20th. This is the year, that is 1789. Now this is known as the Tennis Court Oath. Okay, you have to remember this. Now this was the famous Royal Tennis Court that was in the Versailles Court, right? So here we see that in Versailles, the third state members, they were not happy with the king's decision. So they walked out from the assembly. But then they came to this Royal Tennis Court and they took an oath. What was this oath all about? So it was about the formation of National Assembly by the third state who sought to draft a constitution. Yes, students. Now they decided that they are going to draft a new constitution, and they are not going to leave the court, the tennis court, until they have now proposed a new constitution, until they have drafted a new constitution for France. Now, why was this new constitution needed here? The new constitution that they demanded was mainly to limit the powers of the king, right? And this National Assembly of the third state, it was led by two popular or famous people known as Mirabeau and Abbassius. So these were the two popular people. Now I will tell you one important thing here, that Mirabeau, he was not from the third state, he belonged to a noble family. And Abbassius, he was a priest. Now you might be wondering that why these people who belong to the first and second state, they were leading the third state. Students, these two people, they believed in equality for all, right? So there was not a general assumption among all the people of first and second state to work against the ideas of the will of the third estate. So these two people, they led the National Assembly formed by the third estate that now sought to draft a new constitution for France. Now this was the first stage here. Let's move on to the second stage. What happened then? So finally, when the king, he heard that these people from the third estate, they are not going to move out, and they were adamant, they were wanting to draw a new constitution. They had formed a National Assembly. So, pressurized by the demands of the third estate, Louis XVI was forced to recognize this National Assembly, right, and gave in the demands of the third estate. Now he was feeling very pressurized. The situation here was getting worsened day by day, and therefore under this pressure, the king, he gave in the demands of the third estate. He at the same time, what happened here? Violent action took place from the side of the king, right? At the same time, he ordered his troops to move near Paris. And king's action, it made people fear that he would dissolve the assembly. Now here what are we seeing? That the king, he had ordered his troops in order to move near Paris, and also see that if any unruly action is taking place, then they should suppress it without question. So here the king's action, it made people fear that he might dissolve the National Assembly. The National Assembly that he had recognized forcefully. Okay. So this was the second stage that happened here. Now we will learn about the third, fourth and fifth stage. But here in between we have a question that in what ways did the French Revolution, in what way did the French Revolution mean different aims to different people? Now we have learned about it in the beginning here. So for peasants, if I ask you, what are you going to say? You will say that end to feudalism. Feudalism. Let me correct the spelling here. And cruel taxes that we have learned right now. The second, liberals demanded for new constitution. And when we are talking about the extremists, they believed in equality of all. They wanted France to be a republic and wanted an end to the monarchy. Right? These were the demands of or the aims of extremists. So this is how you are going to answer this question, that it meant different aims to different people here. So coming to the question section here, students, we have a question that says, on what date is Bastille Day celebrated? So this is quite easy question here. What are you going to write in this? You will write 14th July. Why? Because it was on this date in the year 1789 when the Bastille, that is the fortress prison in France, it was stormed, right, by the mob, by people of Paris, right? So here you have to give this answer, that is 14th July, because it is asking on which date is Bastille Day celebrated in France, keeping this in mind. Thank you.